Hi, everybody. I have spent about 10 years in Africa teaching and doing research. And during 4 of those years, a year each time, I walked up and down the southeastern coast of the continent, 1,500 miles during each of those wonderful years, working with storytellers, historians, poets in the oral traditions of the Xhosa, the Zulu, the Swati, and the Ndebele peoples. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that, but let me begin on the other end of the continent. When I first went to Africa, I was going to teach in Uganda, and the plane that I was on landed in Algiers, and I stayed in Algeria, for a couple of weeks to visit some friends of mine. When I was there, I was invited to a big celebration. 2 boys had just passed through their puberty rites of passage. They were just moving into adulthood, and there was a big celebration to commemorate this event in their lives. Present at this celebration was their grandmother. And their grandmother wanted to send her 2 grandsons away from home with a gift. And the gift that she gave them was a story. So this is the first story I heard on African soil. A story about a partridge that goes off into the forest, and it rolls on the forest floor, and rolls on the forest floor, and its feathers take on a beautiful sheen. And the partridge climbs halfway up the mountain and beats its beak against the rock and beats its beak, and its beak becomes a beautiful ruby red color. And the partridge climbs to the top of the mountain and stares at the blue Mediterranean sky, and its eyes become a deep and piercing blue. And this splendid partridge comes down from the mountain, its feathers a sheen, its ruby red beak glowing, and its eyes this splendid blue. And on the outskirts of the village where she lives, a donkey who also lives in the village sees her and says, "You are so beautiful. How did you become so beautiful?" And the partridge says, "Well, I went off into the forest, and I rolled on the forest floor and rolled on the forest floor until my feathers became as you see them. And I climbed halfway up the mountain and beat my beak against the rock until my beak became the ruby red that you see. And I climbed to the top of the mountain and stared at the sky until my eyes became the blue that you see." And the donkey says, "You must not walk into the village. I must carry you into the village in the glory that you deserve." So the partridge gets on the back of the donkey, and the donkey carries her in the village. And all the members of the village come to gaze in rapture at the beauty of the partridge, its magnificent feathers, its ruby red beak, and its deep blue eyes. And among those members of the community who come to look at the partridge is a jackal. And the jackal goes up to her and says, "You are so beautiful. How did you become so beautiful?" And the partridge says, "Well, I went off into the forest. I rolled on the forest floor until my feathers became as you see them. I climbed halfway up the mountain, beat my beak against the rock until my beak became the ruby red that you see, climbed to the top of the mountain and stared at the sky until my eyes became the blue that you see." And the jackal says, "I've got to do that too." And he goes rushing off into the forest, and he rolls on the forest floor, and rolls on the forest floor, and loses all his hair. He climbs halfway up the mountain, beats his nose against the rock, breaks his nose, climbs to the top of the mountain, stares at the sky, becomes blind, trips, falls over a precipice to his death. And so said the Algerian grandmother to her grandchildren, and she's speaking to us today, everybody, from thousands of miles away. Like the partridge, my grandchildren, be everything that you can be. Fulfill yourselves to the extent that you can, but don't, like the jackal, be a phony. And so she told them the story. So that's the first story I heard on African soil. I taught for 2 years in Uganda, but most of the time that I spent in Africa, 8 years, was spent in southern Africa. As I said, 4 of those years walking up and down the southeastern coast of the continent. Let me tell you about one person whom I met, the most magnificent storyteller I have ever met, and I think one of Africa's greatest storytellers. Nongenile Masitatu Zenani was her name. She was a Xhosa, and she was absolutely magnificent. I remember one morning, she started to tell a story at 10 o'clock in the morning. In her audience were about 7 women and 2 men of her age, and then the audience waxed and waned as time went on. She explained to everybody that the epic that she was about to perform, she had heard at the feet of her great aunt when she was a child, and she wanted to tell it once more before she died. And so she started to tell the story at 10 o'clock in the morning. 4 hours later, we took a break, came back in the evening. It went on for 3 more hours, 7 hours. The first time I ever heard a story continued into the next day. The next day, it went on for 4 hours. The next day for 5 hours. And on she went. For 21 days, this woman performed one story. When it was over, it was 150 hours long. It was absolutely magnificent, certainly equal to anything that Homer would have created. It was a glorious story, and I thought, everybody, that I would tell you that story here this morning. Well, obviously, we don't have time to do that, but let me emphasize that storytelling is something that we have to take very seriously. It's not simple little fairy tales. Storytellers take us to the essence of our beliefs, take us to the very core of our belief systems. And everybody needs stories. We all need stories, whether it's on television, on the internet, or around a hearth fire. Storytelling is something that is absolutely essential to the human condition. It always has been, it always will be. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.